In the summer of 1930, deep in the East Texas piney woods, a drilling crew was burning old tires in a boiler just to keep the drill turning. They were nearly out of money. The 70-year-old in charge had already sunk 2 dry wells, and most of the county figured he was either a fool or a con man. What none of them knew was that a few thousand feet down sat the biggest oil fortune in American history. And the strangest part is that the old man who found it would die with almost nothing. Start with the land itself, because that's where this story turns strange. Every major oil company in America had already looked at that stretch of East Texas and written it off. Their geologists studied the ground, decided the rock was all wrong, and swore there was nothing worth drilling for anywhere near those sleepy farming counties. So the big companies never bothered to lease it, which meant the richest oil field on the continent was sitting wide open, waiting for a broke old wildcatter that nobody took seriously. His name was Columbus Marion Joyner, though everybody called him Dad. He'd been a lot of things in his 70 years, a self-taught lawyer, a Tennessee politician, a wildcatter who'd made and lost fortunes chasing oil across Oklahoma. But the thing that mattered most about Dad Joyner was that he could talk almost anyone into almost anything. He'd quote Shakespeare, look a stranger dead in the eye, and walk away with their life savings. And by 1930, he needed that gift more than ever, because he was 70 years old, sick, nearly broke, and famous mostly for failing. What he still had was a dream. He was certain that under that quiet East Texas farmland sat an ocean of oil, and that he was the man who'd finally bring it up. And the way he raised the money to go looking would make him a legend, and in the end, cost him everything. It began with his geologist, a self-taught man named A.D. Lloyd, who everyone knew as Doc. Doc Lloyd was a mountain of a man who'd been all sorts of things in his life, including a traveling medicine show salesman, and he had a real gift for making nonsense sound scientific. To raise money for the drilling, Lloyd wrote up official-looking reports promising that this land sat on top of something he called the apex of the apex, a formation supposedly so rich it existed nowhere else on Earth. The reports looked convincing to a desperate investor, but nearly every geological claim in them would later turn out to be flat wrong. But it worked. Joyner printed up certificates and sold them himself, and store clerks, widows, and dirt-poor farmers handed over what little they had for a piece of his well. And here's where the whole thing started to rot from the inside. Joyner was so desperate for cash that he oversold the well, quietly selling the same slices of it over and over to different people, promising far more than could ever actually exist. It kept the drill turning long past the point where he should have gone bankrupt. But it also meant that if he ever did strike oil, dozens of people would be holding paper that said the same barrels belonged to them. It was a lawsuit waiting to happen, and one day it would come back and destroy him. For years, though, there was nothing to fight over because Joyner kept coming up dry. He'd leased the land from a widow named Daisy Bradford, charming her with promises of the schools and parks that oil money would build for the county. His first well on her farm went down in 1927 and hit nothing. His second got stuck deep underground and had to be abandoned. By the time he started a third well on the Bradford place, the money was long gone. The operation got so poor that the crew fed used tires and scrap lumber into the boiler just to squeeze out a few pounds of steam, drilling a few feet a day. Folks around town started calling the whole thing a joke and Joyner a crook. And Dad Joyner, 70 years old and out of chances, just kept on drilling. Then, that autumn, the third well began to change everything. Deep down, past 3,500 feet, the drill bit into a layer of sand called the woodbine, and when the crew ran a test, oil and gas came surging up out of the hole. The first real proof that the old man had been right all along. Word raced through the countryside. Cars jammed the dirt roads for miles, and thousands of people crowded onto the widow's farm just to watch the oil run. On October 3rd, the well came in for good, and nobody on the entire planet looked more stunned than Dad Joyner himself. The broke old man that the whole county had laughed at had finally struck oil. What none of them understood yet was just how much was down there, because this wasn't a lucky little well. It was the first crack into something enormous. As other drillers rushed in and sank their own wells for miles in every direction, the real picture slowly came into focus. Dad Joyner hadn't found a pocket of oil. He'd tapped the edge of the biggest oil field anyone had ever discovered on the continent. They called it the East Texas Oil Field. It ran about 42 miles from one end to the other and covered roughly 400 square miles across 5 different counties. It held so much crude that some people estimated it was 50 times bigger than Spindletop, the famous gusher that had kicked off the Texas oil age 3 decades before. Over the years that followed, this single field would give up more than 6 billion barrels of oil. A broke old man with a fake geology report and a boiler full of burning tires had drilled straight into the richest patch of ground in the country, and it would turn out to be the worst thing that ever happened to him. And the moment the world understood what was sitting under those farms, all hell broke loose. Fortune hunters, drillers, and roughnecks poured into East Texas by the tens of thousands. Sleepy little farm towns swelled into cities almost overnight. The town of Kilgore went from a few hundred people to tens of thousands in a matter of months. And so many companies crammed so many derricks onto so little ground that a single small city block downtown ended up with dozens of wells packed shoulder to shoulder. People started calling it the world's richest acre. The whole region ran day and night. Derricks ran off toward the horizon in every direction. The roads turned to rivers of mud, and the boomtowns filled up with gamblers, con men, and every kind of trouble that follows fast money. There was so little law that the towns barely had anywhere to put the criminals flooding in, while farmers who'd been just surviving the Great Depression suddenly had oil money coming in faster than they could count it. But all that oil coming up at once was about to create a problem nobody had seen coming. So much crude was coming up so fast that it broke the market itself. The price collapsed. At its worst, oil out of East Texas was selling for as little as a nickel a barrel, cheaper than a glass of lemonade. It got so chaotic and fortunes were being wiped out so fast that the governor of Texas declared martial law and sent the National Guard into the field to force the wells shut and drag the price back up. Think about that for a second. This one discovery was so big that the state had to send in soldiers to hold it back. If you're the kind of person who likes the story buried underneath the famous one, take a second and subscribe. We go digging up forgotten places like this every week, because for all the money this field was making, the man who found it was about to lose every last piece of it. Remember those shares Dad Joyner had oversold? Now that the well was worth a fortune, every one of those investors he'd sold and resold came looking for what they believed they were owed, and the lawsuits piled up fast. His stake in the greatest oil field in the United States got dragged into court and pushed into receivership. And that was exactly the opening a former dishwasher, farmhand, and professional gambler named H.L. Hunt had been waiting for. Hunt had made and lost money in the Arkansas and Louisiana oil fields, and he still had a card player's nerve for a moment like this one. While Joyner was drowning in lawsuits and desperate for any way out, Hunt sat him down in a Dallas hotel and kept him there for 2 solid days of hard negotiating. When it was over, Hunt had bought Joyner's leases and his discovery well for around $1.33 million. And here's the shrewd part. Most of that money was to be paid slowly, out of the oil once it started flowing. In other words, Hunt was buying the whole thing largely with the field's own future. It was next to nothing for what he was getting, and he knew it. It was the gamble of his life, and it paid off beyond anything he could have dreamed. That single deal turned H.L. Hunt into one of the wealthiest men who has ever lived. The oil under those East Texas farms made him, by some accounts, the richest man in America. He built an entire oil empire on top of it, and his family became one of the most famous fortunes in the country. And Dad Joyner, the man who dreamed the whole thing up, who charmed a widow out of her farm, who drilled through failure after failure while the county laughed, who made the biggest oil strike in American history with borrowed money and a boiler full of tires. He walked away with almost nothing. He spent his final years back in Dallas, and in 1947, the father of the great East Texas field died broke. The little town nearest his discovery renamed itself Joynerville in his honor. It was just about the only thing he had left. And here's the part that's almost impossible to believe. Nearly everything Doc Lloyd wrote in those reports was wrong. The science behind the whole thing was fake. The major companies that studied the land and swore there was nothing there had actually been working from better information than Joyner ever had. By every rule that was supposed to matter, that oil should not have been there at all. And yet, there it was, in quantities nobody had ever seen, sitting exactly where a broke old dreamer had sworn for years it would be. That field was so wild, it forced the country to invent the rules that still govern American oil. It fueled the tanks and planes of World War II, and it's still pumping today, almost 100 years later. An ocean of oil, exactly like Dad Joyner always promised. He found it. He just never got to keep it. If you want another piece of American history that got buried on purpose, The next one's already on screen.